Okay, everyone, it's right at 1 p.m. here in the East, and thanks also for those on the West Coast who are joining us for our climate adaptation for forest-dependent wildlife webinar series. We welcome you, and we're glad you've joined us. Today, we're going to be having a speaker, Dr. Jessica Halofsky, and she'll be talking about the effects of climate change and shifting disturbance regimes on wildlife habitat in the Western US. So it should be really interesting. Before I introduce Jessica, we wanted to go over just a few things for you. Sometimes it can be challenging on these webinars to hook up to your audio settings. So from your menu, you should be able to either select a speaker or choose your earphones. You should also be able to switch to phone audio if you have issues with your computer audio, and you should also be able to view your audio settings. If you can flip that to the next slide there, Mark, that'd be great. And then I also wanted to let everyone know this series is a collaboration. It has been great fun putting this together because it has been a collaboration between the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, Forest Ecology Working Group, our Fish and Wildlife Service Science Applications and Migratory Bird Programs, and our National Conservation Training Center. But we've also been joined this year by USDA Forest Service and the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science in sponsoring this webinar series. So again, it has been a lot of fun to put this on. And you will note that today we have an ASL interpreter, so that is nice to allow folks that wouldn't otherwise be able to fully participate to be able to participate. So thank you. And again, if you're interested in information about our Forest Ecology Working Group, you can contact me. And my email is up on the screen now. And if you need credits for either the Wildlife Society or SAF, you can contact Jim Siegel, whose contact information is also up. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, just a few bits of housekeeping before we continue on with the webinar. A quick disclaimer: this product is for educational purposes only. The views, opinions, or positions expressed in this webinar series are those of the guest presenter and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, or positions of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or Department of the Interior. Some of the materials and images may be protected by copyright or may have been licensed to us by a third party and are restricted in their use. Mention of any product names, companies, web links, textbooks, or other references does not imply federal endorsement. Our webinar is being recorded live today, and as a result, we have everyone in attendance muted, but we still want to hear from you and our audience. So at any time during this webinar, please use the chat function for questions or comments. To do so, just click the chat box at the bottom of your screen to open the chat panel. Then you can simply type your question, select everyone from the drop-down menu, and press enter to submit. And also, if you'd like to change your screen view while you are viewing this webinar, simply select view at the top right of your screen, and you should get a little drop-down menu of your different options. And it looks like we'll probably have a few people on camera at a time, so it might be best to select that side-by-side gallery view.
So just to tell you a little bit about our climate adaptation for forest-dependent wildlife webinar series. It is a 12-part series that tells a story about climate change and its impacts on forest ecosystems and the forest-dependent wildlife species. We examine forest ecosystems and their composition and structure under a changing climate and the influence on these wildlife populations and the carbon dynamics within the system. We also share tools and management approaches to help facilitate forest and wildlife climate adaptation at both landscapes and also down at stand scales. You can change the slide, Mark, please. So again, today's presentation is effects of climate change and shifting disturbance regimes on wildlife habitat in the Western US. And the presentation is by Dr. Jessica Halofsky. And I'll just introduce Jessica in just a minute, but I want to first say, we always like to run a commercial for our next webinar. And so our next webinar, we're usually the third Tuesday of each month, so September 20th. And that'll be natural disturbance-based silvicultural strategies, adaptation, and wildlife outcomes. And that'll be Dr. Tony Amato with University of Vermont. Next slide, please. All right, so for today's speaker, Jessica Halofsky is the director of the USDA Northwest Climate Hub and Western Wildland Environmental Threat Assessment Center with the U.S. Forest Service and the Pacific Northwest Research Station. Jessica has her PhD in forest science from Oregon State University. She has an MS in forestry from Penn State and a BS in environmental science from Bucknell University. In her role, Jessica promotes applied climate science and adaptation in natural resources in the Northwest and across the West. In her previous position, she pioneered one of the first climate change vulnerability assessments and adaptation projects with the Olympic National Forest and Park. Since that initial project, Jessica has co-led 10 other sub-regional to regional scale climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation partnerships on federal lands around the West. So Jessica, thanks so much for being willing to join us and give us today's presentation on effects of climate change and shifting disturbance regimes on wildlife habitat in the Western US and beyond. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Chef. Switch over here. All right, great. So today I'm going to focus on effects of climate change on disturbance regimes in the West and how that will impact some broad habitat types. So I'm going to start with an overview of climate change effects on disturbance in forests, and then go into effects of climate change on broad habitat types, and end with some adaptation options. So I want to start with some projections of what we're expecting in terms of temperature increases in the future with climate change. So these maps show projected change in average surface air temperature in the later part of the century relative to the later part of this last century, so 1970 to 1999. And we have several different scenarios for future greenhouse gas emissions and the concentrations of those gases in the atmosphere. Going from the lowest concentration up in the upper left corner here and down to the highest concentrations in the lower right. So in the Western US, we're looking at anywhere from about a 3 to 8 degree Fahrenheit temperature increase by the end of this century. Moving to precipitation, and projections for precipitation are much more uncertain than those for temperature. So these show projected percent changes in seasonal precipitation, again, for the end of the century. And these are using the higher scenarios for greenhouse gas emissions, so the RCP 8.5. So the stippling, or those red dots, indicates that the changes are expected to be large compared to natural variation. So you can see there's more certainty in those precipitation changes at higher latitudes. So we're more certain that actually things are going to get a bit wetter at those higher latitudes in the future across seasons. But the hatching indicates that changes are expected to be small compared to natural variation. You can see there's quite a bit of that. But there's some places where we can see that there's more certainty in the lower 48, that's probably going to get drier in the spring in the Southwest. And it might be drier in the summer in the Northwest and the Northern Rockies into the Midwest. But we are fairly certain with higher temperatures that snow amount and snow residence time, or how long the snow stays on the ground, will decrease. And so this shows snowpack sensitivity for a 3 degree Celsius increase in temperature. And you can see that there's a lot of sensitivity to snowpack a little less so at the higher elevations in the Rockies. Those are still going to stay, they're high enough in elevation that the snowpack will remain at those sites. But you can see there's a lot of sensitivity in the Southwest, Southern Rockies, and up into the Sierras and Southern Cascades and Blue Mountains in Oregon. And so these changes in snowpack have substantial effects on stream flow. And so here on the left, in our current climate, you can see the snowpack in April, and that top left figure is quite high. And that means that in the cold season, a lot of the water is held in snowpack. So we have moderate amounts of water in the cold season. And then that snowpack melts over time. So even in the warm season, our stream flows stay relatively high. There are some temperature increases because the temperatures are warmer. So moving over to the right-hand side, in a warmer climate, we don't have that water being held as snowpack in the cold season. And so our stream flows are actually higher in the cold season. And then that water all runs off into the summer. And so by the warm season, we have less stream flow. And because there are lower stream flow levels and higher temperatures, our stream temperatures are expected to be much higher. And so these increases in temperatures are going to be stressful for our cold water adapted fish species. So we have a great product for the West, and it was being developed for the East, called the Norwest Stream Temperature Database. It's developed by Dan Isaac and others, and it uses a lot of stream temperature information that was collected over time and uses that to project future stream temperatures. And so this is an example of a map we have for the Intermountain region of the Forest Service, with this historical stream temperatures on the left, and then the projected future stream temperatures on the right. You can see there's a bit more red and orange, and those are the temperature ranges we expect to be stressful, if not lethal, to cold water adapted fish species like our salmonids and bull trout. And we know with climate change, the risk of drought is going to increase. So these are projections for change in soil moisture by the end of the 21st century, going from a low emission scenario on the left to a high emission scenario on the right. You can see across the West, we're expecting increases in drought, and increases in the length and severity of drought. But it does depend a lot on emissions and what we do in terms of greenhouse gas concentration in the atmosphere. And with these increases in drought, it's going to have effects on fire. So we have higher air temperature, potentially decreases in summer rainfall in some locations, earlier snow melt, lower snowpack. All this leads to drier fuels and forests. And it really just takes a couple weeks of really high temperature and low rainfall to dry out those fuels and result in pretty extreme fire hazards. Then when we do get ignitions, they're more likely to spread. And this is a look at what we've seen for a change in fire weather days between 1973 and 2020. And so this is the percent change in average annual days where the temperature, relative humidity, and wind speed were all high to result in a high fire danger. You can see they're up to 200% changes across a lot of areas in the West. You see particularly areas of increase in the Sierras, Eastern Oregon, and some of the Southern Rockies as well. And overall, we've seen increases in total area burned in the US. So here we have years on the x-axis between 1985 and 2017, total area burned in millions of acres on this left-hand y-axis. And then we have federal spending on suppression in the billions of dollars here on the right-hand y-axis. So that's in the black line. The red line shows the area burned. You can see over time, area burned has increased, and federal suppression spending has increased right along with it. We've seen that there's been increased costs associated with suppression, with more people in the wildland urban interface. So this is a look from the North Cascades in Washington. We have two figures here. On the left-hand side, we have a figure with July temperature on the x-axis and July and August precipitation on the y-axis here. Each of these circles represents a fire and what conditions they were associated with, according to where it is on the x and y axis. And the larger the circle is, the larger the fire. And you can see that a lot of the large fires took place when the temperatures in July were high and the precipitation was low. We also, on the right-hand side, generally see a positive relationship between fire size and the proportion of the fire that burned with high severity. So we're seeing larger patches of high severity fire with these larger fires. And we're also seeing a synchrony in when fires are occurring in regions. So when we have higher temperatures, we have more water evaporating from the landscape, we have drier fuels, these really large areas of low fuel moisture. And that's when we see we can have a lot of fires occurring in a single region at a particular time. So these are the infamous Labor Day fires of 2020 that took place in Oregon. We had a tremendous amount burning on the west side of the Cascades that year. And there was an extremely low drought, extremely low fuel and soil moisture at that point. And so when combination with some very strong wind events that occurred there, it led to a very large amount of area burned that year in Oregon and somewhat in Washington. We're also seeing in some cases that these wildfires are starting to overlap. So we're getting some areas of reburn. And we have locations in the Northwest where fires have burned 3 times since 2008. So this is showing 3 different fire footprints around Mount Adams in southwestern Washington. And this area in red is the area that has burned 3 times since that 2008 fire occurred. So what can we expect in terms of wildfire area burn in the future? So these are projections to 2050 for a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature. And you can see that the projections are for anywhere up to a 600% increase in annual area burned. But overall, you can think of, for about a 1 degree Celsius increase in temperature, the area burn will be about 2 to 3 times higher what it is today. There are a lot of different kinds of models that project future changes in fire. They have advantages and disadvantages. All of them agree that there will be more fire in the West in the future. We can also look at the probability of very large fire events. And so these are projections for Oregon, Washington, and Idaho, looking at the suitability for large fires. So we have up here on the top, early century, mid-century, and end of century. So colors in the yellow to red show that there is going to be greater suitability for large fire events. You can see it's going from left to right, there's a lot more red, particularly in the Eastern Cascades, Southwest Oregon, up into the Blue Mountains and into Northern Idaho. And then the lower figure shows the predicted change in relative suitability. So you can see that's where there's a substantial increases, again, in those same locations. Climate change is also going to affect insect species and insect outbreaks. So this guy is a mountain pine beetle. This is a native species that has always resulted in outbreaks historically. But with warmer temperatures, we've seen changes in patterns of mountain pine beetle outbreaks. The warmer temperatures have allowed the mountain pine beetle to increase its reproductive rate in some locations. And then the lack of cold winter temperatures have allowed it to expand its geographic range into areas where it has not been as much of an issue historically. And this shows a map of mountain pine beetle outbreaks that have occurred in North America since 1990. And you can see that it has affected a substantial amount of area across North America, especially up into British Columbia, about 20 million hectares total. And there's some concern in the future that insects that have not been primary causes of mortality might become more primary causes of mortality in the future. We have an example here in the Northwest, in Southwest Oregon, where we're seeing a lot of mortality from the flat-headed fir borer on Douglas fir, and haven't really seen this level of mortality before. Mortality is mainly occurring on the drier sites and where forests have encroached on what was most likely historically more of an open woodland ecosystem. And we know that these different disturbances are likely to interact. So in addition to the increases in temperature affecting with climate change, affecting fire and insects, could also be some effects on pathogens. We have changing vegetation, composition, structure, pattern, and also invasive species. And the interactions among these disturbances could really result in some surprises in terms of ecosystem response. And they're really likely to be the driver of ecosystem change with climate change. So what does this mean for forests in the West? I mean, overall, we're likely to see that more reburns will occur with increasing area burned. But the ones of biggest concern are high severity reburns. And that's where we could get fire recurring before the forests have time to recover. And so that could affect regeneration and which species are able to regenerate after fire events. And we know, as I showed in that one figure from the North Cascades, that these larger fires are creating these really large patches of high severity fire. And we have a lot of high fuel loading in our drier forests in the West with fire suppression. And with more extreme fire conditions, we might see more high severity fire. And again, these very large patches of high severity fire. Overall, that could decrease our forest age and decrease a fraction of old growth, which we know a lot of our wildlife species depend on. And really the connectivity of those older forest patches across the landscape. And as our fire-free intervals shorten, we know the time available for plants to mature and produce seed before the next fire could be limited. If the size of our high severity patches really increases, the seed sources could be limited to regenerate in the middle of those high severity patches. And overall, we might see that regeneration takes longer. Another thing is our mature trees are able to cope with quite a lot of climatic variation, but seedlings are more sensitive. And especially those really hot temperatures at the soil surface. So we could see, if we have very hot, dry conditions after fire events, we could see some recruitment failures. And these places really taking up to more than 10 years to get some regeneration, maybe longer. And again, we could see some interactions, particularly with drought and fire, and also drought and bark beetle outbreaks. We know that drought-stressed trees are more susceptible to insect outbreaks. And so again, we're likely to see these interactions among these disturbances. And we could see some shifts in species composition and also in the amount of forest we have in our drier locations in the West. And in general, the regeneration in those really dry locations might be slower and might not occur in some locations. We could see after fire events, the dominance by shrub layers that could last for several decades. And some areas are likely to convert from forest to shrubland or grassland vegetation. And so managers are really going to have to think about where they want to try to forestall that change or where conversions might need to occur. And Jeff, I think this said this is where we would pause for some questions.
Well, thanks, Jessica. There's certainly a lot of fuel up there for discussion. Don't mind the pun, but so first, there are quite a number of questions in the chat. So I'll start with Catherine's, and she says, I remember seeing a study in which fuel-limited dry forests might see an initial increase in annual area burned, but that would be followed by a decrease in a couple of decades because everything will have burned, but less fuel will be produced. And so she's asking, is that true? And how does that fit with increasing fire everywhere?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think that's right. It might take more than a few decades. It just depends on how much fire we get in those systems and also what comes back after. But over time, I do think that we could see new equilibrium in these different forest types with those, again, as you say, those types that are more fuel limited might actually see less fire in the future, and certainly not higher severity fire as we go forward.
There's a couple questions in here, Jessica, and again, I'm just going to take one more now and let you get back to this, and then we'll be able to take some more later. But a couple of them relate to the issue of what comes back after you have these severe burns. One related to, would the soils be sterilized, and would there be the possibility for massive soil loss? And then similarly, Laura asked, once these native conifers have been eliminated by severe fires, are there woody plants or invasives that prevent recolonization of the same kind of ecosystem types that were there before? I think they're kind of related questions, the soil and what returns.
Yeah. We have seen in some cases the soil, when it's subject to extreme heat, that well, first of all, the amount of soil, all the organic matter can be burned off. We can see up to almost a foot of soil matter taken off the surface. So we lose a lot of that, a lot of the nutrients. Fortunately, a lot of our conifer species are good at regenerating on that exposed mineral soil. And so we do eventually see that, there is regeneration there. But yeah, I think there is a lot more potential for invasives to play a role, and in some cases prevent regeneration of some of our native species. So, luckily, I don't think we're seeing a lot of examples of that happening yet, but I do think it's a possibility.
Yeah, you certainly don't have the issues we do here in the East with invasives. But at any rate, so we'll let you continue, and then we'll pick up some questions at the end, Jessica. Thanks so much.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, so I wanted to shift to wildlife habitat and really discuss what these changes in forests and disturbance mean for our wildlife in the West. And so thinking broadly about it, how will climate change affect the fundamental needs of our wildlife species, water, food, shelter, security, and space to move around? And so I'm going to sit back for a minute and summarize a lot of information that has come from climate change vulnerability assessments that have been conducted around the Western US with the Forest Service and other agencies and organizations. And these were all science management partnerships involving scientists from the research branch of the Forest Service, natural resource managers from national forests and other agencies. And the goals of these partnerships were to increase the awareness of climate change in the national forest system and other lands, to conduct science-based vulnerability assessments, and to use those vulnerability assessments as a basis for development of adaptation strategies and more specific on-the-ground tactics. So these assessments have been conducted again around the West. This is a look of all the different efforts that have been conducted. Have covered quite a few national forests. National parks have been a partner along with the Bureau of Land Management. And we've had over 1,400 resource managers participate in these projects. And our basic process that we used is to first establish a science management partnership and to develop a science-based vulnerability assessment over about a year. And then to conduct in-person workshops where we review the vulnerability assessment and identify adaptation options relevant to the local landscape. And then all of our vulnerability assessments and adaptation information is incorporated in a peer-reviewed general technical report published through the Forest Service. So these are all multi-resource assessments. They include future climate projections and then assess vulnerabilities for physical, biological, and other socioeconomic resources. And overall, we look at different components of vulnerability. They include exposure, the amount of change in temperature and precipitation we're expecting, sensitivity, or how much a species or a system will respond to those changes in climate, and then also adaptive capacity, which is the ability of a species or system to cope with climate change. And so I'm going to summarize for a couple different broad habitat types what the different habitat features of those types are, and then what the sensitivity and adaptive capacity we can expect for species that inhabit those general habitat types. So starting with grassland, shrubland, and woodland, this is very high level, so we're definitely putting a lot of different ecosystem types into this category. But in general, these types have a mix of grasses, shrubs, and pinyon or juniper species. A lot of them have rocky features, cliffs or talus, and deep soils for burrowing. And so in general, for these types, a lot of the species that are native to these habitats are adapted to hot, dry conditions. But in some cases, the temperature increases might be too much for them and result in stress. And certainly expect that water may become even more limiting than it already is in a lot of these habitats. And we could see increased fire frequency, maybe severity, contributing to loss of habitat. So there might be opportunities for species in these habitats to shift their range, to track habitat that's not in those, not quite as hot and dry. And then the thermal refugia, or areas where animals can go to avoid the really high temperatures, are going to be really important with increases in temperature. So another important habitat grouping is wetland areas, riparian areas, and other open water. So in these habitats, we have moving or still water. We have vegetation that's associated with these wetter locations, more deciduous trees and shrubs out in our conifer forest contexts. There's woody debris that falls into streams and wetlands that provides habitat. Usually a lot of plant and insect food sources. And in the cases of streams and riparian areas, we have a linear connected pattern of habitat. And so with climate change, we're expecting decreased summer stream flows, maybe decreased groundwater availability that could lead to a drying in these habitats, and so more drought stress. If we have, in some locations, we're expecting more flooding events, and particularly in the winter, that could damage riparian habitat. And overall, the area of cold water streams is likely to decrease. And we also have riparian areas and sometimes wetland vegetation being vulnerable to high intensity fire. And so overall, adaptive capacity is more limited for animals that like these habitats, because they're limited in scope and in their context. All right, now moving to dry ponderosa pine forest, very common habitat out here in the West. In these, we have large trees. They're unevenly spaced. Sometimes you have Douglas fir, but mostly the dominance by our early cereal, more fire resilient species. The understory is usually very diverse, have large snags and logs that are important habitat features. And overall, again, in uneven patterns and spatial complexity areas without trees, and then some patches of more dense trees. And in these types, we may see that their arrangement on the landscape, their distribution on the landscape changes. We might see a loss of dry forest in some locations, gains in the others. And then how the climate change affects wildlife really depends on disturbance, and particularly fire. And low and mixed severity fire, which were where these forests were historically characterized by, can help with the spatial structural complexity, help improve wildlife habitat. It's really those large, high severity fires that can result in habitat loss and overall simplification of the landscape. In some cases, we could see more mortality from summer drought stress, particularly in stands that are very dense and have seen increased density with fire suppression. So again, for these habitats, many of the associated species are adapted to relatively warm, dry conditions. In the case of dry forests, there could be opportunities for upward range shifts or shifts into the more moist forest types overall. So good adaptive capacity for a lot of species in these dry forest types. Okay, moving on a little higher in elevation, and particularly older forests at those mid elevations. So these types, we have a lot of structural and spatial complexity or messiness. We have more of a closed canopy, a lot of different tree sizes, including those older tree components. And snags and logs are really important for wildlife in these forests. So again, with these forests, the wildlife effects are really going to depend on fire and disturbances. And so again, those large high intensity fires can really simplify habitat. We might see more effects of drought stress in these forests. But in generally, there are a lot of fuels in these forest types. And so I do think we could see more high severity fire in the future here. But again, here there could be some opportunities for upward range shifts to higher elevation. But it's the old forest habitat, I think, that's going to be most limiting. Those old forests can take a long time to develop. And we might overall see a loss of some of those old forest characteristics if we get a lot more area burned. Okay, moving to early xeral forests, so forests that occur after disturbance events. And these are actually not very common on a lot of our landscapes anymore, but important. They provide productive herbaceous and shrub understory, a lot of food resources for a lot of species. They have our legacy structures, or those remnant snags, logs, live trees that might be damaged, and a lot of diversity spatially, especially after disturbance that are more mixed in severity. So what happens with the early xeral forest will depend on future disturbance, but we're expecting them to increase in area with more area burned, more insect outbreaks. But if we have those reburns, as I talked about, especially those high severity reburns, sometimes those legacies like snags down wood could be lost. And overall, for adaptive capacity, the wildlife that are associated with these species have pretty high adaptive capacity. They tend to be pretty good at dispersing, have high reproductive rates. And so they're likely to do pretty well in the future with more disturbance. And finally, I want to cover a high elevation type, particularly our high elevation cold forest. And so these forests have a lot of structural and spatial complexity, generally closed canopy, have a lot of those different tree sizes with those large old trees, snags and logs, and an important feature, the deep persistent snowpack. So with climate change, we're expecting that we could see a loss in these cold forest types because the climatic conditions that are suitable for them are projected to decrease. And a key effect here is that loss of the winter snowpack is going to limit those the subnevian environment and not provide as much refugia for species that burrow under the snow to avoid predation. We could see changes in behaviors with winter warming. We could also get some fires up into those higher elevation forests in the future. Another factor here too is their popular recreation sites. And so that could interact with climate effects to affect wildlife and these habitats. Unfortunately, for adaptive capacity, there are fewer opportunities for that upward range shift for species in these habitats. And generally, the wildlife are better adapted to cold than warm. And so it's those refugia, again, that allow these species to avoid those high stressful temperatures are going to be really important for persistence into the future. So overall, for sensitivity, a kind of synthesis here for these different aspects of habitat, we expect there are going to be changes in the availability of food sources for a lot of these species. Water, the changes in snow are going to be really important, and particularly those highest elevations and probably in the lowest elevations too, where we're going to see a lot more drying. As far as shelter, it's really the disturbance processes, especially fire, that are going to affect habitat structure and configuration in the future. And for security, we know that there are going to be interactions with changes in competitors and predators in the future, some of which are a little hard to predict. As far as adaptive capacity goes, we know that the species that are currently adapted to those warm, dry conditions, they could probably find ways to expand the ranges Whereas those that are more adapted to the cold, snowy conditions are probably going to have more limited opportunities. Those refugia, especially the thermal refugia, are going to be really important for species at multiple scales. And overall, species with good dispersal ability, high reproductive rates, they're probably going to do better, or they're going to do well in a changing climate. So shifting focus a little, I want to move to adaptation. And overall, some general principles for adaptation for wildlife. We want to provide abundant, diverse food sources, make sure that we enhance, protect critical water, wetland features. And we want to make sure we retain and recruit as much as possible different habitat structures like big trees, snags, down logs, and provide for heterogeneous landscape patterns. So we have spatially complex habitat, and then make sure we monitor species interactions over time to see how those interactions might be changing with climate change. So I want to provide a couple of examples of adaptation strategies and tactics that have been developed in the climate change vulnerability assessment and adaptation projects that I mentioned previously. So starting just with the vulnerability of increased fire and drought in dry forests from more of a vegetation perspective, a general strategy is to try to increase the resilience to disturbance overall. And so in our dry forest types, that can be done by conducting more intensive thinning and prescribed fire to make sure that we're lowering the density, promoting the large healthy trees, making them more resilient to drought, lowering the fire hazard, and overall trying to promote drought and disturbance tolerant species that will more likely do well in the future. Right, so another vulnerability is a loss of habitat with disturbance for wildlife species. And so overall, we want to try to increase resilience of that later successional habitat and structure that a lot of species depend upon. And so the tactic is really to try to, as much as possible, protect what's out there and try to recruit those legacy structures like large trees, snags, and down wood, so that those are available for the wildlife that depend on them in the future. And we know with increased stream temperatures, again, they're going to be stressful to a lot of our cold water adapted fish species and other species that depend on cold water. So we want to try to restore and maintain that cold water habitat as much as possible. And so we want to make sure we can decrease fragmentation of streams to allow species to move to those cold water areas. We want to try to overall increase hydrologic function and maintain those natural flow regimes. And increasing shade is going to be important. So we have shade over those streams to keep the temperatures down. And finally, for riparian areas and wetlands, we know those lower stream flows and disturbance could be vulnerabilities in the future. And so again, the general strategy is to try to increase the resilience of these systems to drought and disturbance. And so in the future, more drought tolerant native species might be able to do better in those riparian areas than they did historically. And we want to reduce other stressors too. That includes invasive species, intensive grazing or browsing, and also in a lot of these areas, we've seen encroachment of conifers. And so trying to reduce those stressors will make them more able to respond to climate stresses. And overall, we want to try to protect our wetlands and groundwater dependent ecosystems, since we know there'll be changes in hydrology affecting those systems and stressing them. Okay, I did want to mention that a lot of those climate change vulnerability assessments and other products that have been developed as a part of those efforts are available. You can look and see if there's one that's relevant to where you are. They're all available at adaptationpartners.org. I wanted to point out a few other resources too. So all of the climate change adaptation strategies and tactics that were developed in the workshops that I mentioned are in something called the Climate Change Adaptation Library for the Western United States. So that's available at that Adaptation Partners site. And we also worked with our counterparts in the East, so NIACS, to develop a compendium of adaptation approaches. So this covers the entire US and has adaptation strategies and tactics. You can search by resource area, climate change effect, and region to find some ideas that might be helpful for you in any adaptation efforts you might be involved with. Again, I'll put some of those URLs up here, and I'm happy to take questions.
So that was great, Jessica. You covered a ton of stuff. So, and there are quite a few questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But I'll start with a big one, and this one's too general for you to cover too much on. But I do think it might be a good place to start. And this is from Mark, and he says, "Is there a big difference between Western fires and Eastern fires besides just the particular tree species that are lost?"
Yeah. Well, when you come down to it, I guess a fire is a fire. You know, there aren't a lot of differences in size. It depends on the system you're talking about. You know, we do have differences in fuel properties between those Eastern hardwood systems and the Western conifer systems. But overall, a lot of the ecology and concepts I think are very, very similar. I think one of the biggest differences between the West and East is, particularly in the Southeast, there's a lot of prescribed fire that happens in those ecosystems. And we haven't been able to conduct prescribed fire to that degree in the Western ecosystems. And so I think that's a big difference in terms of management of fire. And, you know, I think the occurrence of really large, high severity fires doesn't happen as much in the East because of that difference in management.
Right. I think that's a key point, Jessica. And I think that, you know, one thing I really appreciated your approach on, you know, the various different forest systems and the impacts to them. And when you think about Western systems, you were talking about the early cereal stage forests, likely, you know, the species in those forests being able to adapt. But for instance, in the Northeast, there's so little early successional habitat. You know, we have, you know, all our forests are, you know, 70 years old and, you know, have canopy closure. And so it's really, there are a lot of differences in that regard, just the forest systems that we have. So, you know, our early successional wildlife species are in many cases ones that are, you know, having a lot of problems in the East. So it's interesting to think of. So there's some great questions in here. Let me get to one this one is a big picture question. And so listen carefully. This one's from Ian, and it's, so he says so he starts with a statement. At present, ecosystems operate in a quasi-static equilibrium with lots of interdependencies. So changes to one species population or behavior causes adjustments to others. And there are, again, all these synergistic impacts. But are there any thoughts about the prospects that sufficiently rapid climate change will cause cascading changes that make the ecosystem shift into a non-equilibrium mode. And so what might happen, extinctions? I mean, are we seeing are we predicting those kind of impacts on the landscape?
Yeah. Yeah, that sounds like a conversation over adult beverages.
Or
Yeah.
a thesis, maybe.
Yeah. So I don't think we're seeing evidence of that kind yet, but I think there certainly is a possibility that could occur, that we could see these cascading effects, and it might be that we're in a state of non-equilibrium for a while. I think we were talking a little bit about that with the fire regimes, where it's shifting. We could see a shift from more of a mixed severity fire regime into a low severity fire regime with climate change in the future. And so maybe some of those high severity fire regimes will become more mixed. And so that's going to change, spatial patterning and all sorts of processes and interactions in the future. So I think we could be in that shifting state for a while before we get to equilibrium again.
Right. And so this question is kind of similar. It just asks it in maybe a different way, and so it might allow us to get to it a little differently. Are you finding any empirical or modeling evidence of thresholds or tipping points where forest systems and fire sheds will essentially lose all resilience for recovery to pre-fire conditions? And I think you kind of alluded to that in some systems. And so I was, do you have any specifics specific systems maybe that you think where that really is a threat?
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a lot of people looking at forest regeneration, and particularly at those kind of ecotones between the dry forest and non-forest. I think there is starting to be more evidence that shift might be happening, that regeneration is not, forest regeneration is not happening in those driest locations. And we're seeing that shift to non-forest in some cases.
Great. Let me see. So I did notice an earlier question asking about the Norwest system and the status of that. Mark asked, hey, when's it coming? Do you know the status of when it's coming to the east?
I don't. Maybe Maria can answer that question if she knows the answer. But I know it was in the works, but I'm not sure of the exact status.
Maria, if you don't mind putting that in the chat. I don't think we gave you
she doesn't know
privileges to say anything.
Yeah.
She's usually she has something to say though. All right. So there's a ton of questions. I'm trying to yeah. Sorry, you guys. I'm just trying to see. There's so many I didn't catch that came in at the end, and there's an ongoing conversation in the chat, and so we do have. I will let folks know that we have a process where we try to capture the questions that we weren't able to get to, and we'll work with Jessica and see if we'll group those up and try to answer them and send them back to folks later. And usually, we have some links and stuff in there that might be helpful for you guys later. I'm trying to go back to the thread here. Related to adaptation, Mark asks, are biologist colleagues sharing tactics from drier regions for use across the West, like guzzlers and other water retention collection devices? So that's related to adaptation for some species. Is that enough information to answer that question, Jessica? No.
I think the question is just about sharing from maybe drier regions.
Yeah, well, yes.
Well, I think that's one of the main objectives of that adaptation library too, is that so people can kind of share ideas from different systems and kind of adapt them to their local areas. But yeah, I think that is a good point, that we can take the management actions from drier systems and start applying those in the wetter systems as things change.
Right. And so Jessica, you also talked about your when you were doing your vulnerability assessments, you had a science management work group. How did you pull people together for those groups? You know, how big, how inclusive were they, and was the, you know, the focus to really apply what you learned to managers on the ground, or was it more of a research type focus?
It was really to try to apply that information on the ground. And so it depended on which project. Sometimes there are groups, kind of 2 or 3 national forests, and we could have 100 people at a workshop kind of thinking through the vulnerability assessment and what that means for adaptation. But some of the larger regional projects, there were a series of 5 or 6 workshops with 50 people at each, so quite a few people involved in those efforts. They were always inclusive of other agencies, organizations that work with particular national forests.
And are there places that if folks want to engage in those kind of activities, that is that something maybe we can share later, Jessica? I know like NIAX has some great training programs that some of our biologists were engaged in here in the Northeast, and it allowed them to go back to their refuges and think about, you know, vulnerability on their refuges. So are there, where would you suggest how people learn more?
Yeah, I think the hub websites often have that kind of information. Probably NIAX website has a lot of that for Eastern areas. But I think the hub website would be a good place to go just to see what activities are happening in different regions. We do try to keep that updated with events and trainings like that. And then a lot of the hubs also have newsletters, so you can get in touch with your regional hub and see if they have a newsletter with information like that.
No, great suggestion. So we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to ask you one more question here, but I recognize that lots of folks have to leave. So thanks for everyone that was able to join us. But so this is a question from Sally, and again, I think this is along the same theme. And so it says, if current forests are replaced by less complex forest systems, and again, I'm not sure you said that was going to necessarily happen, but that's an interesting question. That if forests are replaced by less complex forests that are more resistant to fire, then I expect much lower wildlife and biodiversity as a result. Are you seeing examples of that yet? Simpler systems.
Yeah. I mean, I think we are seeing examples of where we have those really large areas of high severity fire, where we do have more simple forest structure. But I don't know if there is evidence of decreased biodiversity in those areas yet. But I don't know of examples, although they could be out there.
So I just want to thank you again, Jessica. This was, you know, you gave a great presentation. It had a tremendous amount of information in it, and I think we're all going to be thinking about it for a while. So thanks so much, and thank you to everyone who joined us today. With that, we'll sign off. Thank you.
Great, thank you.